The morning sun cast long shadows across the narrow streets of Windermere Cross, a small coastal town that seemed to exist outside of time. Frances Cole unlocked the door to Morrison's general store at precisely 6:30, as she had done every morning for the past 20 years. The familiar jingle of the bell above the door welcomed her into the dimly lit shop that smelled of fresh bread, coffee, and the faint salt air that permeated everything in this seaside town. At 67, Frances moved with the careful precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy while maintaining efficiency. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her blue eyes, though marked by age, remained sharp and observant. She wore her usual uniform, a simple cardigan over a plain blouse, comfortable trousers, and sensible shoes. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything remarkable. To the people of Windermere Cross, she was simply Frances, the reliable cashier at Morrison's, the woman who always remembered your name and asked after your family. She began her morning routine, checking the till, arranging the newspapers that had been delivered an hour earlier, and switching on the coffee machine. The store wouldn't officially open until 7, but Frances liked these quiet moments before the day began. They gave her time to think, to prepare, to center herself. Through the window, she could see the town slowly waking up. Thomas Brennan, the postman, made his way down High Street with his characteristic hurried walk. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop was already setting up her display outside her door. Young Jamie Walsh cycled past on his way to the bakery where he worked. It was a predictable pattern, one that repeated itself day after day, and Frances found comfort in this predictability. 20 years ago, her life had been anything but predictable. Frances didn't allow herself to think about those days very often. The memories remained locked away in a part of her mind she had deliberately closed off, like a room in a house that you keep shut, because opening it would let in too much pain. But sometimes, in these quiet morning moments, fragments would slip through. The sound of sirens, the smell of burning rubber, the weight of responsibility that had pressed down on her shoulders every single day. She had been Detective Chief Inspector Frances Cole then, head of the traffic division for the Metropolitan Police in London. It had been a demanding job, one that required intelligence, dedication, and an ability to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. She had been good at it, very good. Her record spoke for itself. Dozens of dangerous drivers taken off the roads, numerous successful prosecutions, and a reputation as someone who never gave up on a case. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. The bell above the door jingled, pulling Frances from her thoughts. She looked up to see Michael Morrison, the store's owner, stepping inside. He was a round-faced man in his 50s with a perpetual smile and a kind disposition that made him popular in the community. "Morning, Frances," he said cheerfully, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "Another beautiful day in paradise, eh?" Frances smiled. "Good morning, Michael. The papers are ready, and I've just put the coffee on." "You're a treasure," Michael said, making his way to the back office. "What would I do without you?" It was a rhetorical question, one he asked often, but Frances appreciated the sentiment. Michael had given her this job 20 years ago when she had arrived in Windermere Cross with nothing but a small suitcase and a desperate need for a fresh start. He had asked no questions about her past, had simply offered her a position and welcomed her into the community. She would be forever grateful for that kindness. At 7 o'clock, Frances unlocked the front door and flipped the sign to open. Within minutes, the morning regulars began to arrive. First was Arthur Henley, a retired fisherman who bought the same items every day: a newspaper, a pack of mints, and a lottery ticket. "Morning, Frances," he said, placing his items on the counter. "Lovely weather we're having." "Indeed, Arthur. Will you be taking the boat out today?" thinking about it. Might catch some mackerel if the tide's right. He paused, counting out exact change from his worn leather wallet. You should come out sometime. Could use a good deckhand. Francis chuckled. I think my seafaring days are behind me, Arthur. Nonsense. You're young yet. Well, younger than me, anyway. He grinned, showing teeth that had yellowed with age. Thanks, Francis. See you tomorrow. The morning continued in this pleasant, unhurried way. Customers came and went, each interaction brief but genuine. Francis knew most of them by name, knew their preferences, their families, their small joys and concerns. This was what she loved about Windermere Cross, the sense of community, the connections that formed naturally when people lived and worked side by side for years. Around mid-morning, Sarah Henderson came in with her twin daughters, Emma and Lucy, who were about 7 years old. The girls ran straight to the candy section, their excited chatter filling the store. Just 2 each, Sarah called after them before turning to Francis with an apologetic smile. Sorry about the noise. Don't apologize, Francis said warmly. It's nice to hear children's laughter. Sarah began loading items onto the counter. Milk, bread, some vegetables, a box of tea. How have you been, Francis? We haven't had a chance to chat properly in weeks. I've been well, thank you. Keeping busy with the store. And you? How's the gallery doing? Sarah ran a small art gallery on the seafront, showcasing work by local artists. It's picking up now that we're heading into summer. Had a group of tourists from London last week who bought 3 paintings. Can you believe it? That's wonderful news. The twins returned with their candy selections, and after some negotiation about which colors were acceptable, the transaction was completed. As Sarah and the girls left, Francis watched them through the window, Sarah's hand holding each daughter's as they walked down the street. A familiar ache settled in her chest, but she pushed it away. That was another path not taken, another life she might have lived. The afternoon shift passed quietly. Michael handled the stockroom while Francis managed the counter. They had developed an easy working relationship over the years, one that required little communication. Francis appreciated that Michael didn't pry into her personal life. He seemed to sense that she valued her privacy, and he respected that boundary. At 5 o'clock, Jenny Marsh arrived for the evening shift. Jenny was a university student who worked part-time to help pay for her education. She was studying marine biology and had endless enthusiasm for her subject, which she was happy to share with anyone who would listen. Francis, did you hear about the dolphin pod spotted off the north coast? Absolutely incredible. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more. I'm thinking of taking a boat out this weekend to see if I can observe them. Would you like to come? Francis smiled at the young woman's excitement. That sounds lovely, Jenny, but I'll have to decline. You know me. I prefer to keep my feet on solid ground. One day I'll convince you, Jenny said, tying on her apron. You can't live by the sea and not experience it properly. I experience it just fine from the shore, Francis replied, gathering her things. Have a good evening, Jenny. As Francis left the store, she paused for a moment to look at the town she now called home. High Street stretched in both directions, lined with small shops and businesses that had served the community for generations. There was Mrs. Patterson's flower shop, the bakery where Jamie Walsh worked, the small post office, the pub called The Anchor that had stood on the same spot for 300 years. Beyond the buildings, she could glimpse the sea, its surface glittering in the late afternoon sun. This was her world now. Small, contained, safe. She had made peace with that choice, or at least she told herself she had. Francis walked the familiar route to her cottage, which sat on the edge of town overlooking the coast. It was a small stone building with a red door and a garden that she tended with care. She had bought it shortly after arriving in Windermere Cross, using most of her savings and her police pension. It was the first place that had truly felt like home since her childhood. Inside, the cottage was neat and simply furnished. Frances had never been one for clutter or excess. In the living room, a single bookshelf held her collection of mystery novels and a few books on gardening. The kitchen was small but functional. Her bedroom was upstairs, with a window that looked out over the sea. She made herself a simple dinner, grilled fish with vegetables from her garden, and ate while listening to the evening news on the radio. The announcer spoke of events in London, of political debates and economic concerns, of the wider world that Frances had once been part of but now felt distant from. After dinner, as was her habit, Frances took her evening walk. She had a regular route that took her along the coastal path, a stretch of about 2 miles that offered stunning views of the sea. The path was well maintained, with benches placed at intervals where walkers could stop and rest while enjoying the scenery. This evening, the air was clear and slightly cool, perfect for walking. Frances set out at her usual steady pace, nodding to other walkers she passed. There was old Mr. Chen, who always walked at sunset. There was the young couple, the Martins, who had moved to Windermere Cross just last year. There was Rachel Stewart, who ran the bookshop, out with her energetic border collie. The coastal path ran parallel to the beach for most of its length, sometimes dipping close to the waterline, sometimes rising up on rocky promontories that provided panoramic views. Frances knew every turn, every landmark, every seasonal change in the landscape. In spring, wildflowers bloomed along the path. In summer, families came to enjoy the beach. In autumn, the light took on a golden quality that made everything seem magical. And in winter, storms would crash against the rocks, sending spray high into the air. As she walked, Frances allowed her mind to wander, processing the events of the day, planning for tomorrow, thinking about nothing in particular. This was her meditation, her therapy. The rhythm of walking, the sound of the waves, the feel of the wind on her face, these things brought her peace. She reached her usual turning point, a large flat rock that marked the 2-mile mark, and paused to catch her breath. From here, she could see the entire sweep of the bay, with Windermere Cross nestled at its curve. The town's lights were beginning to come on as darkness fell, creating a warm glow against the deepening blue of the sky. Frances stood there for several minutes, simply breathing, simply being. Then she turned and began the walk back home. That night, as Frances prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the past more than usual. Perhaps it was something about the changing season. It was late April now, approaching the anniversary of when she had arrived in Windermere Cross. Or perhaps it was simply the way memories worked, surfacing unbidden at unexpected moments. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the framed photograph on her nightstand. It showed a much younger Frances, perhaps in her early 40s, standing in uniform beside her police vehicle. She was smiling, confident, professional. That woman seemed like a stranger now. Frances had joined the police force at 23, young and idealistic, believing she could make a difference. She had worked her way up through the ranks, proving herself capable at every level. She had specialized in traffic policing, drawn to the challenge of keeping the roads safe, of catching those who drove recklessly and put others at risk. The work had been demanding but rewarding. Every dangerous driver she took off the road, every prosecution she secured, felt like a small victory. She had received commendations, promotions, recognition from her superiors, and respect from her colleagues. She had been good at her job, perhaps too good. The work had consumed her life, leaving little room for anything else. There had been relationships, of course, but none that lasted. The hours were long, the stress was high, and the emotional toll was significant. Most people couldn't understand what it was like to deal with the aftermath of serious accidents, to notify families of deaths, to see the worst of human behavior day after day. Eventually, Frances had stopped trying to explain it, had stopped trying to maintain connections with people who couldn't comprehend her world. The job had become everything. She had told herself that was enough. And then had come that day, that terrible day that had changed everything. Frances could still remember every detail with painful clarity. It had been a Wednesday in March, a cold day with intermittent rain. She had been in her office at the station, reviewing case files, when the call had come in. A hit and run on the A40, a pedestrian struck by a vehicle that had failed to stop. Witnesses reported a dark-colored car, possibly a BMW, traveling at high speed. Frances had responded immediately, leading a team to the scene. The victim was an elderly woman named Margaret Thornton, 73 years old, who had been crossing at a pedestrian crossing when she was hit. She had been thrown several meters by the impact and lay on the wet pavement, unconscious and critically injured. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her while Frances and her team began their investigation. They collected witness statements, searched for CCTV footage, put out alerts for the vehicle. Frances coordinated everything with the precision that had become second nature to her, but even as she gave orders and made decisions, a part of her knew, somehow knew, that this case would be different. Margaret Thornton died in the hospital 6 hours later without regaining consciousness. She had 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a husband of 50 years who sat beside her bed, holding her hand until the end. Frances had stood outside the hospital room, watching through the window as the doctors turned off the machines, as the husband, a small, frail man, bent over his wife's body and wept. Something had broken inside Frances at that moment, something that had perhaps been cracking for years, but had finally shattered. The investigation had continued for months. They had found the car, abandoned and burned out in a warehouse district. They had traced its movements through CCTV footage, had interviewed dozens of people, had followed every lead, no matter how small. But they never found the driver. Forensic evidence had been destroyed in the fire. The registration had been false. Every trail led to a dead end. For Frances, who prided herself on thoroughness, on never giving up, on seeing every case through to its conclusion, this failure was devastating. She had met with Margaret Thornton's family multiple times, had looked into the eyes of children who had lost their mother and grandchildren who would grow up without their grandmother, and she had had to tell them that justice would not be served, that the person responsible would not be held accountable. The case had remained officially open, as all such cases did, but Frances knew the truth. The driver was gone, vanished into the anonymity of a large city, and would likely never be found. The failure had consumed her. She had become obsessed with the case, working every possible angle, pursuing leads that her colleagues told her were hopeless. She stopped sleeping properly, stopped eating regularly, stopped engaging with anything that wasn't related to finding Margaret Thornton's killer. Her superior officers had noticed, of course. They had suggested she take time off, had recommended counseling, had expressed concern for her well-being. But Frances had refused. She couldn't stop, couldn't let it go. Not when Margaret Thornton's killer was out there somewhere, living their life as if nothing had happened. The breakdown, when it finally came, was both sudden and inevitable. Frances had been at her desk, going through witness statements for what must have been the 100th time, when she simply stopped. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't function. The weight of not just this case, but every case she had ever worked, every death she had investigated, Every piece of suffering she had witnessed came crashing down on her all at once. She had been found by a colleague and taken to hospital. The diagnosis was severe burnout with depressive symptoms. The prescription was rest, counseling, and a significant break from work. Frances had taken medical leave, spending 3 months in a kind of gray fog, going through the motions of daily life without really being present. The counseling had helped somewhat, helping her to understand what had happened, to recognize the signs of burnout, to begin the process of healing. But Frances had known even then that she couldn't go back. The person she had been, the confident, capable detective, was gone. In her place was someone broken, someone who had failed when it mattered most. So she had made a decision. She would leave London, leave the police force, leave behind everything that reminded her of what she had lost. She would start over somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful, somewhere she could heal. She had chosen Windermere Cross almost at random, finding it on a map during one of her sleepless nights. It was far from London, small enough to be quiet, but large enough to have basic amenities. And it was by the sea. Frances had always found the ocean calming, even as a child. Perhaps, she had thought, living by the sea would help her find peace. And so, 20 years ago, at the age of 47, Frances Cole had arrived in Windermere Cross with one suitcase and a determination to start over. She had rented a room above the bakery at first, had found the job at Morrison's General Store, and had slowly, carefully, built a new life. She had never told anyone in Windermere Cross about her past. As far as they knew, she was simply Frances, a woman of a certain age who had moved to town and worked as a cashier. Some people probably assumed she had been divorced or widowed, that she was escaping some personal tragedy. But no one asked, and she offered no information. In a small town, people were curious but also respectful of boundaries. After a while, she simply became part of the community, accepted without question. The years had passed, and Frances had gradually healed. The nightmares became less frequent. The guilt became more manageable. She learned to live with what had happened, to accept that she had done her best, even if her best hadn't been enough. But she had never quite forgiven herself, and she had never forgotten Margaret Thornton. Now, sitting in her bedroom in her cottage in Windermere Cross, Frances carefully returned the photograph to its place on the nightstand. The past was the past, she told herself. She had built a good life here, a peaceful life. That was enough. She turned off the light and lay down, listening to the sound of the waves in the distance. Usually the sound helped her sleep, but tonight, for some reason, she felt restless. There was something in the air, some sense of unease she couldn't quite name. Eventually, sleep came, but it was troubled and unsettled. The next few weeks passed without incident. Frances continued her routine, work at the store, evening walks, quiet nights at home. Spring turned into early summer, and Windermere Cross began to fill with tourists who came to enjoy the beach and the coastal scenery. The store became busier, which Frances welcomed. The extra work kept her mind occupied, and the days passed quickly. One evening in mid-May, Frances was on her usual walk when she noticed something unusual. It was later than she typically walked. She had stayed late at the store to help Michael with inventory, and darkness had fallen completely. The coastal path was illuminated by widely spaced streetlights that created pools of light separated by stretches of shadow. As Frances approached a section of the path that ran close to the beach, she heard voices. This wasn't unusual in itself. People often walk this path in the evening. But there was something about these voices that caught her attention. They were hushed, urgent, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Frances slowed her pace, her old police instincts awakening. She could see figures on the beach below the path, perhaps 10 or 12 people. They were standing near a small boat that had been pulled up onto the sand. As she watched, more people emerged from the boat, stumbling as they reached the shore. In the dim light, Frances couldn't make out details, but she could see that the people from the boat were moving with the exhaustion of those who had traveled far. They were being directed by two men who stood apart from the group, gesturing and speaking in low voices. Frances stopped walking, standing in the shadow between two streetlights. She watched as the group was led from the beach to the car park above, where two minibuses were waiting. The people were loaded into the vehicles quickly, efficiently. The whole operation took less than 10 minutes. Then the minibuses drove off, heading north out of town. The boat was pushed back into the water and disappeared into the darkness. Within moments, the beach was empty again, as if nothing had happened. Frances stood very still, processing what she had seen. Her rational mind told her there could be innocent explanations. Perhaps it was a private tour group, or people arriving for some early morning event. But her instincts, honed by 25 years in the police force, told her something different. The secrecy, the late hour, the efficiency of the operation, all suggested something illicit. She continued her walk home, but her mind was working. When she reached her cottage, instead of going straight to bed, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about what she had witnessed. If this was what she suspected, human smuggling or trafficking, it was serious. People's lives could be at risk. But what should she do? Call the police? Based on what? She hadn't seen anything definitively illegal. She hadn't seen any weapons or any evidence of coercion. For all she knew, those people had come willingly, perhaps paying for passage to start a new life in Britain. And yet, something felt wrong. Frances trusted her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that what she had witnessed was not innocent. She decided to wait, to watch. If this was part of an ongoing operation, it would happen again. And if it happened again, she would gather more information before deciding what to do. Over the next week, Frances paid closer attention during her evening walks. She varied her times slightly, walking earlier some days and later others. She was looking for patterns, for anything unusual. 3 nights later, she saw it again. This time she was prepared, having deliberately timed her walk for after dark. She positioned herself in a spot that offered a good view of the beach while keeping her in shadow. She wore dark clothing and kept her phone ready. The boat arrived around 11 o'clock. Again, people were brought ashore. Frances counted 14 this time. And again, they were loaded into waiting minibuses. Frances made note of as many details as she could. The approximate size of the boat, the number of people involved, the vehicle registration numbers. She took several photos with her phone, though in the darkness she doubted they would be clear enough to be useful. As before, the entire operation was completed with remarkable efficiency. The people being brought ashore showed signs of exhaustion and fear. Some were helped off the boat, stumbling as they reached the sand. The men directing the operation showed no concern for their well-being, simply herding them toward the vehicles with impatient gestures. When the minibuses left, Frances noted the direction, north again, on the main road that led out of town. She committed the registration numbers to memory, repeating them silently as she walked home. In her cottage, Frances wrote everything down in a notebook: recording dates, times, descriptions, and the vehicle registration numbers. She stared at what she had written, feeling a familiar sensation stirring inside her. The need to investigate, to understand, to solve the puzzle. She had promised herself when she came to Windermere Cross that she would leave that part of her life behind. She had promised herself peace, quiet, a simple existence. Getting involved in this would mean stepping back into a world she had deliberately left. But could she really ignore what she was seeing? Could she turn a blind eye while people, possibly vulnerable people, possibly people in danger, were being smuggled through her town? Frances closed the notebook and sat for a long time, wrestling with the decision. The old Frances, Detective Chief Inspector Frances Cole, would have already contacted the authorities, would already be formulating an investigation plan. But the new Frances, the one who had spent 20 years healing from burnout and trauma, hesitated. In the end, it was the memory of Margaret Thornton that decided her. She thought of that elderly woman, struck down by a driver who had never been found, never been brought to justice. She thought of Margaret's family, their grief, their unanswered questions. Frances had failed them once. She had failed to bring them justice, to give them closure. She wouldn't fail again. That night, Frances made a decision. She would investigate. She would gather information. She would find out what was happening in Windermere Cross. And then, when she had something concrete, something undeniable, she would contact the authorities. But she would do it carefully. She would not let this consume her as the Thornton case had done. She would not sacrifice her health, her peace, her hard-won stability. She would investigate, but she would also protect herself. It was a balance she had never managed to achieve before. But perhaps, after 20 years of learning to live with her limitations, she could manage it now. Frances approached the investigation with the methodical precision that had once made her an excellent detective. But this time, she was careful to maintain boundaries. She would investigate only during specific times, would not let it interfere with her work or her basic self-care. She would observe, record, and analyze. But she would not become obsessed. Her first step was research. Using the computer at the town library, Frances didn't have internet at home and preferred it that way. She searched for information about human smuggling operations in coastal areas. She was careful to clear her search history, not wanting to draw attention to her activities. What she found was sobering. Human smuggling was a significant problem along the British coast, particularly in more remote areas where surveillance was limited. The people being smuggled were often refugees or migrants seeking a better life, but the operations were typically run by criminal organizations that charged exorbitant fees and provided dangerous conditions. The library research also told her about patterns these operations typically followed: late-night arrivals, use of small boats, coordination with ground transportation, and regular schedules. What she had witnessed matched these patterns precisely. Armed with this information, Frances began a more systematic observation routine. She continued her evening walks, but now she paid particular attention to certain locations. She noted the times of boat arrivals. They seemed to follow a schedule, approximately every 4 to 5 days. She observed the people involved in the operation. Always the same 2 men directing things on the shore. Always minibuses with dark-tinted windows. She also began to pay attention to other details. Where were the minibuses coming from? Where were they going? Were there any buildings in the area that might be used as temporary housing for the smuggled people? One evening, Frances decided to follow one of the minibuses. It was a risky move, and she knew it, but she needed more information, and observation from a distance would only tell her so much. She had prepared for this. She had her own car, a modest sedan that she rarely used, preferring to walk most places in town. She had parked it in a location that offered a view of the beach access point, and she waited, engine off, lights out. When the minibus appeared, Frances waited until it passed, then started her car and followed at a discreet distance. She was rusty at this kind of work, but some skills never fully left you. She kept several car lengths back, turned off her headlights when possible, and tried to remain inconspicuous. The minibus headed north out of Windermere Cross, as she had expected. It stayed on the main road for about 15 minutes, then turned off onto a smaller road that led inland. Frances followed, her heart beating faster. This area was more rural, with fewer houses and more farms. After another 10 minutes, the minibus turned into a long driveway leading to what appeared to be an old farm complex. Frances drove past slowly, not wanting to draw attention. She continued for another mile, then turned around and drove back, parking in a lay-by that offered a distant view of the property. She watched for an hour, noting details: the layout of the buildings, the presence of lights in what appeared to be a large barn, the fact that no one seemed to leave the property. Finally, satisfied that she had learned what she could for now, Frances drove home. Over the next several weeks, Frances built up a detailed picture of the smuggling operation. She observed 3 more boat arrivals, each time noting the pattern, the timing, the people involved. She drove past the farm property several more times, always careful not to attract attention. She noted the registration numbers of multiple vehicles that came and went from the property. She also began to observe patterns in the town itself. She noticed that certain people, strangers, not locals, would appear in Windermere Cross on the days when boats were expected. They would spend time near the beach, seemingly casual but clearly watching. These were scouts, Frances realized, making sure the coast was clear for the operation. All of this information went into her notebook, which she kept hidden in her cottage. She created timelines, drew maps, recorded license plate numbers and physical descriptions. It was almost like being back on the job, except this time she was working alone, without resources, without backup, without authority. But Frances was careful. She maintained her normal routine, worked her shifts at the store, participated in community activities. To everyone in Windermere Cross, she was the same Frances they had always known. No one suspected that the quiet cashier was conducting a criminal investigation. There were moments when Frances questioned what she was doing. What if she was wrong? What if this was all innocent and she was seeing criminality where none existed? What if she got caught observing and put herself in danger? But then she would think of the faces she had seen in those brief glimpses. Exhausted, frightened faces of people who had clearly endured hardship. Whether they had come voluntarily or not, they were being exploited by whoever was running this operation. And that was enough to keep Frances going. By early June, Frances felt she had enough information to contact the authorities. She had dates, times, locations, vehicle descriptions, and a clear pattern of activity. This was more than sufficient for the police to begin their own investigation. But Frances hesitated. Who should she contact? The local police station in Windermere Cross was small, staffed by just 3 officers who primarily dealt with minor issues like parking violations and the occasional pub fight. This operation was clearly bigger than anything they could handle. She could contact the regional police force, but what would she say? She was a civilian reporting suspicious activity. Would they take her seriously? Would they act quickly enough? Or would bureaucracy and procedure slow everything down, possibly giving the smugglers time to change their operation or disappear entirely? And there was another concern, one that Frances was almost ashamed to admit, even to herself. She didn't want to hand this over yet. She had spent 20 years in Windermere Cross being just Frances, the cashier. No one knew about her past, about what she had been capable of. Part of her wanted to see this through, to prove, if only to herself, that she was still that person, that the skills and instincts that had once defined her hadn't completely atrophied. So Frances continued to observe, to gather information, to build her case. She told herself she was being thorough, making sure she had all the facts before involving the authorities. But in truth, she knew she was stalling, drawn back into the work that had once meant everything to her. It was Michael Morrison who inadvertently provided Frances with her next breakthrough. One morning in mid-June, as they were setting up the store, Michael mentioned that he had heard something interesting from his brother-in-law. who worked for the local council. "Apparently," Michael said, stocking shelves with canned goods, "there's been some concern about that old Henderson farm north of town. You know the one? Was abandoned for years after old man Henderson passed away?" Frances felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice casual. "I know it. What's the concern?" "Well, it got sold about a year ago. Private sale, all very quiet. No one really knew who bought it, but apparently there's been quite a bit of activity there recently. Vehicles coming and going at odd hours, that sort of thing. The council's been getting complaints from some of the neighboring farmers about noise and lights at night." "That's interesting," Frances said carefully. "Do they know what's going on there?" Michael shrugged. "No idea. Could be anything, really. Maybe someone's trying to renovate it, turn it into a business or something. But it is a bit odd, keeping everything so secretive." After Michael moved to another part of the store, Frances stood very still, processing this information. The Henderson farm. She had driven past it several times during her surveillance, had noted it as the destination for the minibuses. Now she had a name for it, and more importantly, she knew that others had noticed unusual activity there. This changed things. If the local authorities were already aware of something strange at the farm, they might be more receptive to information about the smuggling operation. That evening, instead of her usual walk, Frances drove to the area around the Henderson farm. She parked in a different lay-by this time, one that offered a better view of the main buildings. Using binoculars she had purchased from a shop in the next town over, she observed the property more carefully. The farm consisted of several buildings, a main farmhouse, which appeared dark and possibly uninhabited, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. The barn showed signs of activity, lights visible through cracks in the walls, vehicles parked nearby. Frances noted 3 vehicles, 2 minibuses, and a large van. As she watched, the door to the barn opened and several people emerged. They were too far away for Frances to see clearly, even with the binoculars. But their body language suggested they were workers or guards, rather than the people being smuggled. Frances photographed everything she could with her phone, though the distance and darkness made it difficult. She stayed for 2 hours, until the activity at the farm seemed to settle down for the night, then drove home. Over the next week, Frances continued her observation routine, alternating between watching the beach for boat arrivals and surveilling the Henderson farm. She was building a comprehensive picture of the entire operation, how people arrived, where they were taken, who was involved. She also began to notice something else. The people brought in by boat didn't stay at the Henderson farm for long. After a few days, they would be transported elsewhere. Frances managed to follow one of the minibuses on one such occasion, watching as it joined the motorway heading south. She couldn't follow it all the way. That would have taken her too far from home and work. But she noted the direction and approximate time. This suggested that the Henderson farm was just one point in a larger network, a temporary holding location before people were moved to their final destinations. The scale of the operation was bigger than Frances had initially thought. It was becoming clear that she couldn't handle this alone. She needed to contact the authorities with what she had learned. But she wanted to be strategic about it. She needed to ensure that her information would be taken seriously, that action would be taken swiftly. Frances spent an evening at the library, researching which agencies would be most appropriate to contact. Human smuggling fell under the jurisdiction of several different bodies: the police, immigration enforcement, even the National Crime Agency for more serious organized crime. She decided that her best approach would be to contact the regional police directly, specifically their Serious and Organized Crime Division. But before she did that, she wanted one more piece of evidence, something that would make her case irrefutable. Frances knew that what she was planning was dangerous. She also knew it was necessary. She needed definitive proof of what was happening, something beyond observations and notes, something that would force the authorities to act immediately. She had been planning this for 3 days, working out the details, considering the risks, preparing for various contingencies. It went against every instinct of self-preservation she had developed over the past 20 years. The safe thing, the smart thing, would be to hand over what she had already gathered and let the professionals handle it from there. But Frances had spent too long watching, too long gathering pieces of a puzzle. She needed to see the full picture. And more than that, though she was reluctant to admit it, she needed to prove to herself that she was still capable, that the detective she had once been wasn't completely gone. It was a Tuesday night, 4 days after the last boat arrival. Based on the pattern she had observed, the next arrival would be tomorrow night. That gave her a window of opportunity. The people currently being held at the Henderson farm would likely be transported elsewhere soon, before new arrivals needed the space. Frances had noticed that the farm was most active in the early morning, around 5 or 6 o'clock, when vehicles would arrive and depart. But the late night hours, from around midnight to 4 in the morning, seemed relatively quiet. That would be her window. She prepared carefully. She wore dark clothing, black trousers, a dark blue jacket, dark trainers. She brought her phone, fully charged, set to silent. She brought a small flashlight, also dark-colored, that wouldn't be visible from a distance. She had a small camera with a zoom lens that she had purchased years ago, but rarely used, and she had a whistle in case of emergency. Frances left her cottage at 11:30, driving with her lights off until she was well away from her street. She knew this was paranoid, but paranoia kept you safe when doing something this risky. She parked her car in a different location this time, about a mile from the Henderson farm, in a small wooded area off a country lane. She would approach the farm on foot, keeping to the shadows and the tree lines. The night was overcast, with no moon visible, perfect for her purposes, but also more challenging for navigation. Frances had studied maps of the area and had done a reconnaissance walk during daylight hours several days ago, so she knew the terrain. But walking it in near total darkness was a different matter. It took her 30 minutes to reach a position near the farm buildings. She moved slowly, carefully, testing each step to avoid making noise. Her heart was pounding, from exertion, from fear, from adrenaline. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this way, and despite the danger, there was something almost exhilarating about it. From her position behind a low stone wall that bordered the property, Frances had a good view of the barn. There were lights on inside, visible through gaps in the walls. She could hear voices, faint but definitely present. Someone was awake in there. Frances crouched behind the wall for several minutes, simply observing. She counted at least 2 people moving around inside the barn, visible occasionally as shadows against the lighted walls. The minibuses and van were parked nearby, exactly where she had seen them before. She waited for the right moment, then carefully made her way closer, moving from the wall to a cluster of bushes, then to an old tractor that had been abandoned near one of the outbuildings. Each movement was slow and deliberate. She could feel her age in her joints, in her muscles, but she pushed through it. From the position near the tractor, Frances could see more clearly into the barn through a crack in the wall. Inside, she could see the people being held there. There were perhaps 20 or 25 of them, mostly young men, but also some women and a few teenagers. They were sleeping on the floor on thin mattresses or blankets, crowded together in the space. 2 men sat near the door, talking in low voices. One of them was smoking, the cigarette glowing in the darkness. They appeared to be guards, making sure none of the people tried to leave. Frances raised her camera and began taking photographs. The quality wouldn't be perfect. The light was poor, and she was shooting through a crack in the wall. But they would show the conditions, the crowding, the presence of guards. This was evidence. She was so focused on taking photographs that she almost didn't hear the sound behind her. Almost. But that old police instinct, that awareness of one's surroundings, made her pause and turn. There was someone behind her, perhaps 20 meters away, walking from the direction of the farmhouse. Frances froze, pressing herself against the tractor, praying that she would blend into the shadows. The person, a man, from his size and build, walked past her hiding spot without seeing her, heading toward the barn. Frances held her breath until he was gone, then slowly, carefully, retreated the way she had come. Her hands were shaking as she made her way back to the stone wall, then into the trees beyond. That had been too close. If that man had looked her way, if he had decided to check the area around the tractor, she would have been discovered. And then what? She was 67 years old, alone, in the dark, facing people who were clearly involved in criminal activity. The walk back to her car seemed to take forever. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. But finally, she reached the wooded area where she had parked, got into her car, and sat there for several minutes, trying to calm her racing heart. She had the evidence. She had photographs that clearly showed people being held in conditions that were, at the very least, questionable and most likely illegal. Combined with everything else she had gathered, this should be enough to prompt immediate action. It was time to contact the authorities. The next morning, Frances called in sick to work for the first time in 5 years. Michael was concerned. She was never ill, but accepted her explanation of a stomach bug without question. Frances felt guilty about lying, but she needed time to organize her information and make the necessary contacts. She spent the morning at her kitchen table, going through her notebook, organizing her photographs, creating a timeline of events. She had dates and times for 5 separate boat arrivals. She had vehicle registration numbers. She had photographs of the Henderson farm and the people being held there. She had maps showing the routes taken. It was a comprehensive package, the kind of evidence that would make any investigator take notice. The question was how to present it. Frances could simply call the police and report what she had seen, but that seemed insufficient. A phone call could be dismissed, could get lost in bureaucracy. She needed something more formal, more compelling. She decided to write a detailed report, the kind she would have written in her old life as a detective. She spent several hours on it, laying out the facts clearly and logically, including references to dates, times, and evidence. She described the pattern of arrivals, the operation at the Henderson farm, the transportation network. She noted that neighboring farmers had already complained about unusual activity at the farm, which could be verified through the local council. When the report was finished, Frances read it over several times, making small revisions. It was professional, thorough, and convincing. Anyone reading this would understand the seriousness of the situation. The next question was who to send it to. Frances decided on a multi-pronged approach. She would send copies to the regional police force, specifically to their serious and organized crime unit. She would also send a copy to the National Crime Agency, whose jurisdiction included human smuggling operations. And she would send a copy to a local member of parliament, just to ensure that the issue received attention at multiple levels. But there was a problem. If she sent the report under her own name, it would raise questions. How did a cashier at a general store come to conduct such a detailed investigation? Why hadn't she reported this earlier? And most problematically, her past would come out. People would learn that she was a former police detective, and her carefully constructed privacy would be shattered. Frances sat with this dilemma for a long time. She could send the report anonymously, but that would reduce its credibility. Anonymous tips were often dismissed as unreliable, but protecting her privacy, maintaining the quiet life she had built, was important to her. In the end, she reached a compromise. She would send the report under her own name, but would include a brief explanation of her background. She would be honest about her past as a police officer, but would request that this information be kept confidential if possible. It was a risk, but it was necessary. Frances typed up a cover letter. To whom it may concern, my name is Frances Cole. I am a resident of Windermere Cross and have been for the past 20 years. I am writing to report what I believe to be a human smuggling operation that is using our town's coastline as a point of entry. I should explain that prior to my retirement, I served for 25 years with the Metropolitan Police, retiring at the rank of Detective Chief Inspector in the Traffic Division. While I am no longer in law enforcement, my training and experience have allowed me to recognize patterns of criminal activity. Over the past several weeks, I have observed and documented what appears to be an organized operation smuggling people into the country via small boats landing on Windermere Cross Beach. These individuals are then transported to a property known as the Henderson Farm, located approximately 15 miles north of town. I have compiled a detailed report of my observations, including dates, times, descriptions, and photographic evidence. This information is attached. I believe this matter requires urgent attention and request that appropriate action be taken immediately. I would appreciate if my identity and background could be kept confidential if possible, as I have lived quietly in this community for many years and wish to continue doing so. However, I am willing to provide further information or testimony if required. Please do not hesitate to contact me if you need clarification or additional details. Respectfully, Frances Cole. She included her phone number and address, then attached the detailed report and selected photographs. The complete package was extensive, nearly 20 pages plus images. Frances printed multiple copies, addressed envelopes, and drove to the post office in the next town over to mail them. She didn't want the postmark to be from Windermere Cross. It was a small precaution, but seemed worthwhile. As she dropped the envelopes into the postbox, Frances felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had done what needed to be done, had reported a serious crime with detailed evidence. Now it was in the hands of the authorities. They would investigate, they would take action, and the smuggling operation would be shut down. But a part of her wondered what would happen next. Would the authorities act quickly? Would they take her information seriously despite her civilian status? And would her involvement remain private, or would the truth about her past come out? These questions swirled in her mind as she drove back to Windermere Cross. She stopped at the store to let Michael know she was feeling better and would be back at work tomorrow. She went home, made herself dinner, and tried to relax. But sleep was difficult that night, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. The days that followed were among the most difficult Frances could remember. She returned to work, resumed her normal routine, and waited for something to happen. But nothing did. A week passed, then 2 weeks. Frances received no communication from any of the authorities she had contacted. There were no police investigations visible in town, no increased activity around the Henderson farm that she could detect. It was as if her detailed report had simply disappeared into a bureaucratic void. Frances tried to be patient. She knew how these things worked, or at least how they had worked when she was on the force. Reports had to be reviewed, investigated, verified, resources had to be allocated, warrants had to be obtained. These things took time. But as the days continued to pass with no response, Frances began to worry. Had her report been taken seriously? Had it even been read? Or had it been dismissed, filed away, forgotten? Meanwhile, the smuggling operation continued. Francis observed 2 more boat arrivals during this time, each following the same pattern as before. People were brought ashore, transported to the Henderson farm, then moved on after a few days. The operation was running smoothly, without interruption. Francis felt a growing frustration. She had done everything right. She had gathered evidence, documented everything carefully, presented it professionally, and yet nothing was happening. People were continuing to be smuggled through Windermere Cross, possibly exploited, possibly in danger, and no one was doing anything about it. She began to second-guess herself. Had she made a mistake in how she presented the information? Should she have contacted the local police first instead of going straight to the regional and national levels? Should she have pushed harder, made phone calls instead of just sending letters? Or worse, had she been wrong? Had she misinterpreted what she was seeing? Was this something legal that she didn't understand? Number. Francis trusted her instincts and her observations. She knew what she had seen. This was human smuggling, pure and simple. And if the authorities weren't acting, then there had to be a reason. 3 weeks after sending her report, Francis decided to take further action. She couldn't call the Serious and Organized Crime Unit or the National Crime Agency directly. She didn't have direct contact information, and trying to navigate bureaucracy by phone would be futile. But she could do something else. She decided to contact Sergeant David Hughes, the senior officer at the Windermere Cross Police Station. It was a risk. She would have to reveal more about what she knew and what she had been doing, but she felt she had no choice. At the very least, she could make a formal report to the local police, creating an official record that would be harder to ignore. Francis went to the police station early one morning before work. The station was a small building on Station Road, staffed by just 3 officers who worked rotating shifts. Sergeant Hughes was in his early 50s, a career policeman who had spent his entire professional life in small-town policing. Francis had interacted with him occasionally over the years. He sometimes came into the store, and he seemed competent and conscientious. When Francis entered the station, Hughes was at the front desk, working on paperwork. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Francis." "Good morning. What can I do for you? Not reporting a crime, I hope." Francis took a breath. "Actually, Sergeant, I am. Or at least, I need to talk to you about something I've observed." "Is there somewhere we could speak privately?" Hughes's expression became more serious. "Of course. Come through to the office." He led her to a small office at the back of the station and gestured for her to sit. "Now then, what's this about?" Francis had prepared what she was going to say, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself hesitant. Once she started this conversation, there would be no taking it back. Her privacy, her quiet life, might be compromised. But she thought of those people on the beach, exhausted and frightened, and she began to speak. "Sergeant Hughes, I need to report what I believe is a human smuggling operation using Windermere Cross as a point of entry." Hughes's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious allegation, Francis." "What makes you think that?" "I've observed it directly. Over the past few months, I've witnessed multiple instances of people being brought ashore by boat late at night and then transported away in vehicles." Francis spent the next 30 minutes telling Hughes everything she had observed. She showed him her notebook, her photographs, her detailed timeline. She explained about the Henderson farm, about the pattern of arrivals, about the organization of the operation. Hughes listened carefully, occasionally asking questions for clarification. When Francis finished, he sat back in his chair, looking troubled. This is quite significant, Francis. I have to ask, how did you come to be conducting such a detailed observation? This is well beyond what a normal citizen would do." Francis had known this question was coming. I have some background in investigation, Sergeant. Before I moved to Windermere Cross, I worked in law enforcement. In what capacity? I was a detective chief inspector with the Metropolitan Police. I served for 25 years, mostly in traffic division. Hughes's expression shifted from surprise to understanding. I see. And you've been living here for 20 years without anyone knowing about your background? I retired early due to health reasons and wanted a fresh start. I've never hidden my past deliberately, but I've never volunteered the information either. Hughes nodded slowly. That's understandable. But Francis, and please don't take this the wrong way, if you had this kind of background and you suspected human smuggling, why didn't you come to us immediately? Why conduct your own investigation? It was a fair question. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing before making accusations. And I did try to report it. 3 weeks ago, I sent detailed reports to the Regional Police Serious and Organized Crime Unit, to the National Crime Agency, and to our local Member of Parliament. I've received no response from any of them. You sent reports? Detailed reports? Hughes looked troubled. And you've heard nothing back? Nothing at all. Hughes was quiet for a moment, then stood. Francis, I need to make some calls. Would you mind waiting here for a bit? Of course. Hughes left the office, and Francis could hear him speaking on the phone in the main area of the station, though she couldn't make out the words. He was gone for perhaps 20 minutes. When he returned, his expression was grave. Francis, I've just spoken to my contact at regional headquarters. Your report was received, and it was forwarded to the appropriate division for investigation. However, he paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. There's apparently already an ongoing operation related to this matter. They've asked me to tell you that they appreciate your vigilance, but that you need to stop your own investigation immediately for your own safety and to avoid interfering with their work. Francis felt a surge of mixed emotions. Relief that her report had been taken seriously, that action was being taken. Frustration that she hadn't been informed, and concern about what ongoing operation meant. So they are investigating? Yes. Apparently, they have been for some time. Your information has been helpful in confirming some of their intelligence, but they need you to step back now. Human smuggling operations can be dangerous, and they don't want civilians putting themselves at risk. I understand, Francis said, though part of her wanted to argue, to point out that she wasn't just any civilian. Can you tell me anything about their investigation? I'm afraid I can't. I don't have those details, and even if I did, it would be confidential. What I can tell you is that they take this very seriously and are working to address it. But Francis, his tone became firmer. I need your word that you'll stop your own surveillance. No more nighttime observations, no more following vehicles, and definitely no more going near that farm. What you did was remarkably brave, but it was also remarkably risky. Promise me you'll leave this to the professionals now. Francis wanted to protest, wanted to argue that she was a professional, that she had skills and experience that could be helpful. But she looked at Sergeant Hughes's concerned face and realized that he was right. She had done what she needed to do, reported the crime, provided evidence. Now it was time to let others take over. I promise, she said. Good. And Francis, thank you. What you did, gathering all that information, that took courage and skill. But please, stay safe now. As Francis left the police station and walked back to the store, she felt oddly deflated. She had expected to feel relief, satisfaction, a sense of accomplishment. And those feelings were there, certainly. But there was also a sense of anticlimax, of being sidelined just when things were getting interesting. For months, she had been engaged in meaningful work, using skills she thought she had left behind, feeling useful and capable in a way she hadn't felt in years. And now it was over. Now she was just Frances the cashier again, watching from the sidelines while others took action. She told herself this was how it should be, that she had made the right choice in stepping back. She had done her part. It was time to return to her quiet life. But as she walked through the familiar streets of Windermere Cross, Frances couldn't quite shake the feeling that the story wasn't over yet. Frances tried to follow Sergeant Hughes's instructions. She tried to return to her normal routine, to stop thinking about the smuggling operation, to trust that the authorities were handling it. But it was harder than she had anticipated. Every evening on her walks, she found her eyes drawn to the beach, looking for signs of activity. Every time she drove past a minibus, she found herself checking the registration number against her mental list. The investigator's instinct that she had reawakened was not so easily put back to sleep. And then, 2 weeks after her conversation with Sergeant Hughes, something happened that made it impossible for her to stay on the sidelines. It was a Thursday evening, and Frances had just finished her dinner when she heard raised voices outside. This was unusual. Windermere Cross was a quiet town, and loud disturbances were rare. She went to her window and looked out. 2 houses down from hers lived the Martinez family: Carlos, his wife Elena, and their 3 teenage children. They had moved to Windermere Cross 3 years ago, when Carlos got a job at the local marina. They were well liked in the community, friendly and hardworking. Now, Carlos was standing in his front garden, gesturing emphatically at 2 men who stood by a dark-colored van parked on the street. Even from a distance, Frances could see that Carlos was angry, his voice raised though she couldn't make out the words. Elena appeared at the door, looking worried, calling something to her husband. One of the men by the van stepped toward Carlos, and there was something threatening in his posture. Frances felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just a neighborly disagreement. This was something more serious. She watched for another moment, then made a decision. She grabbed her phone and walked quickly to the Martinez house. As she approached, she could hear what Carlos was saying. "I don't care what you think you're doing. This is my neighborhood, and I'm not going to—" "Mr. Martinez," Frances interrupted, stepping into the garden. "Is everything all right?" The 2 men by the van turned to look at her. Frances recognized them immediately. They were the same men she had seen coordinating the boat arrivals on the beach. Up close, she could see more details. Both were in their 30s. Both had the hard look of people accustomed to violence. One had a scar across his left cheek. The other wore expensive-looking watch that seemed incongruous with the rest of his working-class appearance. Carlos turned to Frances, his face flushed with anger and something else. Fear, perhaps. "Frances, thank you, but this is—" "We're just having a conversation," the man with the scar said, his voice smooth but with an undertone of menace. "Nothing to concern yourself with, love." Frances met his gaze steadily. "It sounds like more than a conversation. If there's a problem, perhaps we should call the police?" "That won't be necessary," the other man said quickly. He looked at Carlos. "We'll talk about this another time." "Think about what we said." The 2 men got into their van and drove off. Carlos watched them go, his hands clenched into fists. Elena came out of the house, putting her arm around her husband. "Carlos, what was that about?" Frances asked quietly. Carlos looked at her, clearly torn between caution and the need to tell someone. Elena squeezed his arm, and he seemed to make a decision. "Can we talk inside?" he asked. In the Martinez's living room, over cups of coffee that Elena insisted on making, Carlos told Frances what had happened. His story explained much and made Frances's blood run cold. Carlos worked at the marina, and part of his job involved keeping track of boats that came and went, maintaining logs of arrivals and departures. Several months ago, he had noticed something odd. Certain boats were arriving very late at night, not following the normal check-in procedures, not being registered in the logs. He had mentioned this to his supervisor, who had told him to mind his own business and not to record those boats. This had troubled Carlos, but he had let it go until last week, when he happened to be working a late shift and saw one of these boats arrive. He had seen people being offloaded, not sailors or fishermen, but what looked like migrants, exhausted and frightened. He had seen them being loaded into vans and driven away. Carlos had realized he was witnessing something illegal, probably human smuggling. He had struggled with what to do. Should he report it to the police? But if his supervisor was involved, if the marina management was involved, wouldn't reporting it put his job at risk? And more than that, wouldn't it put his family at risk? He had decided to document what he saw, taking photos on his phone when he could do so safely. He had been planning to go to the authorities once he had enough evidence. But somehow, the people running the operation had found out. The two men who had confronted him tonight had warned him to stop asking questions, to stop paying attention to things that didn't concern him. They had been very clear about what might happen if he didn't comply. "They didn't threaten me directly," Carlos said, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "They were too clever for that." But the implication was clear. "They know where I work, where I live. They know I have a family." Frances felt a cold anger building inside her. This was exactly what she had been afraid of. That innocent people would be drawn into this situation, would be threatened, would be put at risk. "Carlos," she said carefully, "have you gone to the police?" "Not yet. I was planning to, but after tonight." He looked at Elena, who looked frightened. "I don't know if it's safe. If they found out I was documenting things, they might find out if I go to the police. And what if nothing happens? What if the police can't do anything quickly enough? Those men know where we live." Frances understood his fear. She also understood that this situation had just become much more serious. If the smugglers were threatening witnesses, if they were actively trying to intimidate people who might expose their operation, then they were more organized and more dangerous than she had thought. "Listen to me carefully," Frances said. "You need to go to the police, and you need to do it tomorrow. Go to Sergeant Hughes at the local station. Tell him everything. Show him your evidence. Tell him about these men and their threats. The police can provide protection if necessary." "But what if—" "Carlos, these people are criminals. They're breaking serious laws, and they're involving other people in their crimes. Your supervisor at the marina, he's potentially an accomplice. This operation needs to be shut down, and you have information that could help do that. But more than that, you need protection, and the police can provide that." Carlos looked uncertain, but Elena nodded. "She's right, Carlos. We can't just pretend this didn't happen. What if they come back? What if they threaten the children?" "I'll go with you tomorrow if you'd like," Frances offered. "I have some experience with these matters. I can help you make sure the police take this seriously." "Would you?" Carlos looked relieved. "That would help. Thank you, Frances." After Frances left the Martinez house and returned to her own cottage, she stood for a long time at her window, looking out at the darkening street. The situation had escalated in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was one thing for her, a former police officer who understood the risks, to investigate this operation. It was entirely another for innocent civilians like Carlos Martinez to be drawn in and threatened. She had promised Sergeant Hughes that she would step back, that she would leave this to the professionals, but circumstances had changed. The smugglers were becoming more aggressive, more desperate. They were threatening people in Windermere Cross, in her community, and she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Frances made a decision. Tomorrow she would take Carlos to the police station and make sure his report was taken seriously. And then, whether the authorities liked it or not, she was going to finish what she had started. She was going to make sure this operation was shut down permanently. The detective in her, the person she had been before Margaret Thornton's death, before the burnout, before the retreat to Windermere Cross, was fully awake now, and she wasn't going to sleep again until this was resolved. The next morning, Frances met Carlos outside his house at 8 o'clock. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his eyes shadowed with worry. Elena came out to see them off, holding their daughter Sophia close. "Be careful," Elena said, kissing her husband. "We'll be fine," Frances assured her. "This is the right thing to do." At the police station, Sergeant Hughes listened to Carlos's story with growing concern. He examined the photos on Carlos's phone, made notes, asked detailed questions. When Carlos described the confrontation the previous evening, Hughes's expression darkened. "This is witness intimidation," he said. "That's a serious offense on top of everything else. Mr. Martinez, I want you to write down everything you can remember about those two men, their appearance, what they said, the license plate of their vehicle. Frances, did you see them as well?" "I did," Frances confirmed, "and I can identify them. They're the same men I observed coordinating the boat arrivals on the beach." Hughes made more notes, then sat back. "All right. Mr. Martinez, I'm going to be honest with you. This situation is more complex than it appears. As I mentioned to Frances previously, there's an ongoing investigation into the smuggling operation you've witnessed. Your information is valuable, and I'm going to pass it along to the investigating team immediately. But I need to contact them first, see what they want us to do." "What about the protection Carlos requested?" Frances asked. "Those men know where he lives. They've made implicit threats. I'll address that with the regional team. In the meantime, Mr. Martinez, I'd recommend varying your routine, being aware of your surroundings, and calling us immediately if those men approach you again. I'll have our patrol car drive by your house more frequently." Frances wanted to argue that this wasn't enough, but she also understood Hughes's position. He was a local officer with limited resources, dealing with a case that was beyond his usual jurisdiction. After they left the station, Carlos looked at Frances with worry. "Do you think that's enough? Varying my routine?" "For now, yes," Frances said, though she felt the same concern. "But Carlos, I want you to promise me something. If you see those men again, if anything else happens that makes you feel unsafe, you call me immediately." She wrote her phone number on a piece of paper. "Anytime, day or night, I'll help however I can." "Thank you, Frances. You've been very kind." As Frances walked back to the store, she was already late for her shift. Her mind was working. The fact that the regional police had an ongoing investigation was good, but how long had it been ongoing? And why hadn't they acted yet? Every day that passed was another day the operation continued, another day people were being smuggled and exploited, another day innocent people like Carlos were at risk. At the store, Michael expressed concern about her being late, but accepted her explanation of helping a neighbor with an urgent matter. The morning passed in its usual routine, but Frances's mind was elsewhere, turning over possibilities, considering options. Around mid-morning, a familiar face came into the store. It was Rachel Stewart, who ran the bookshop. She looked troubled. "Morning, Frances," she said, placing a newspaper and a box of tea on the counter. "Have you heard about the commotion last night?" "Commotion?" "Down at the marina. Apparently there was some kind of argument. Some people are saying it was about illegal activity, though no one seems to know for sure. You know how rumors spread in a small town. I hadn't heard, Francis said carefully. Well, people are talking. Some of the shop owners are concerned. We've always thought of Windermere Cross as a safe place, you know? If there's criminal activity happening here. Rachel trailed off, looking worried. After Rachel left, Francis thought about this. If word was spreading about problems at the marina, that might actually be helpful. Public pressure might prompt faster action from the authorities, but it could also make the smugglers more desperate, more willing to take risks to protect their operation. That afternoon, Francis's concerns proved prescient. Sergeant Hughes came into the store during Francis's break, looking serious. Francis, can we talk privately for a moment? They went into the small back office of the store. Hughes closed the door and spoke quietly. I've heard back from the regional team. They're not happy. They say that by bringing Mr. Martinez to report, by spreading information about the operation, we risk compromising their investigation. They've asked me to tell you, again, to stop involving yourself in this matter. Francis felt her anger rise. Sergeant Carlos Martinez was threatened by members of a criminal organization. He had information about that organization. He had every right, in fact, an obligation, to report it to the police. Are you telling me he should have stayed silent to avoid compromising an investigation? That's not what I'm saying. I'm just passing along what they told me. And what about protection for Mr. Martinez? What about the fact that these criminals are now actively threatening people in our community? Hughes looked uncomfortable. They've assured me they're working on it. They say the investigation is in its final stages and they don't want to move too soon and risk the suspects escaping. Final stages, Francis repeated flatly. And how long have they been in final stages? Because from what I've observed, this operation has been running smoothly for months without interruption. Francis, I understand your frustration. Do you? Francis surprised herself with the sharpness in her voice. Do you understand what it's like to watch a crime happen, to report it properly through channels, and then to be told to stand down while nothing gets done? Do you understand what it's like to see innocent people threatened and to be told that protecting them might compromise an investigation? Hughes was quiet for a moment. No, he said finally. I don't. I work in a small town where the most serious thing I usually deal with is a drunk driver or a bar fight. This is well above my level. But Francis, I'm trying to do the right thing here. I'm following proper procedure. Quote, I know you are, Francis said, softening her tone. I'm sorry. I know you're doing your best. But Sergeant, I need you to understand something. I spent 25 years in the police force. I know how these investigations work, and I know how bureaucracy works. I also know that sometimes when the higher-ups say, we're working on it, what they really mean is, we're trying to figure out what to do. I'm concerned that this investigation isn't as far along as they're claiming. What are you suggesting? Francis was quiet for a moment, weighing her words. I'm suggesting that we might need to take matters into our own hands. Francis, just listen. I'm not suggesting we do anything illegal or dangerous, but we can't just sit back and wait while criminals operate in our town and threaten our neighbors. There must be something we can do. Hughes looked torn. What did you have in mind? Francis had been thinking about this since the previous evening. Documentation, public pressure. If we can make what's happening here more visible, if we can get the media involved, if we can generate enough attention, the authorities will have to act. They'll have no choice. The media? Francis, you know how the higher-ups feel about unauthorized information being released. It could jeopardize the entire case. Or it could force them to finally take action, Francis countered. Look, I'm not talking about going to the newspapers today, but we should at least consider it as an option. In the meantime, we can document everything that happens. If there's another boat arrival, if there's another intimidation incident, we record it. We create a timeline that's irrefutable. Hughes was silent, clearly struggling with this suggestion. Finally, he spoke. I can't officially support this. If my superiors found out, I'd be in serious trouble. But, he paused, I also can't tell you what to do in your personal time as a private citizen. And if you happen to observe something and happen to document it, well, that's your right. Francis understood what he was saying. Thank you, Sergeant. Just be careful, Francis. These people have shown they're willing to threaten witnesses. I don't want you getting hurt. I'll be careful, Francis promised. After Hughes left, Francis felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't going to wait for the authorities anymore. She was going to take action. But she would be smart about it. She would be strategic. And this time, she would make sure that the evidence she gathered was so compelling, so irrefutable, that the authorities would have no choice but to act immediately. The detective was back, and she had work to do. Based on the pattern Francis had observed, the next boat arrival would be in 2 days, Saturday night. She spent Friday preparing. She made sure her phone was fully charged and set up so she could record video. She planned her observation point carefully, choosing a location that would give her a good view of the beach while keeping her safe and hidden. She also did something she had never done before in Windermere Cross. She told someone the complete truth about her past. She asked Jenny Marsh, the university student who worked at the store, to meet her for coffee at the Anchor pub after their shift. Over tea, neither of them was drinking alcohol, Francis explained who she really was and what she had been doing. Jenny listened with wide eyes, asking occasional questions for clarification. So you're like a real detective? That's incredible, Francis. I was a detective, Francis corrected. Past tense. I haven't been in law enforcement for 20 years. But you've been investigating this smuggling thing on your own. That's so brave. What can I do to help? Francis appreciated the young woman's enthusiasm, but was also careful. Actually, there is something. I'm going to be observing a potential boat arrival tomorrow night. I don't want to do this alone. If something goes wrong, I want someone to know where I am and to be able to call for help if needed. Like a lookout? More like backup. I'll text you when I leave my house and when I arrive at my observation point. I'll check in every 30 minutes. If you don't hear from me as scheduled, call Sergeant Hughes immediately and tell him where I am. Jenny agreed enthusiastically, and Francis felt better knowing someone would be watching out for her. Saturday came, and Francis went through her normal routine: work at the store, a light dinner at home. She dressed in dark clothing and prepared her equipment: phone, binoculars, a small notepad, a flashlight with a red filter to preserve night vision, and a whistle for emergencies. At 10 o'clock, she texted Jenny, "Heading out now." She drove to her usual parking spot, then walked carefully to her observation point, a cluster of rocks and bushes that offered a good view of the beach while providing cover. She settled in and texted Jenny again. "In position. All clear." The wait was long. Francis used the time to review what she knew, to think through various scenarios, to prepare mentally for different possibilities. The night was cool and slightly windy, with clouds obscuring the moon intermittently. At 11:15, Francis's phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Checking in. All okay?" "All okay," Francis replied. At 11:35, she saw it. A small boat, running without lights, approaching the beach. Frances felt her heart rate increase. She raised her phone and began recording video. The boat reached the shallows, and several people jumped out to pull it onto the beach. Then the passengers began disembarking. Frances counted 15 people, men, women, and what appeared to be several teenagers. Even from her distance, she could see their exhaustion, the way they stumbled as they stepped onto the sand. The two men she had seen before were there, directing the new arrivals. And there was someone else. A third man, older, who seemed to be in charge. He spoke briefly to the boat crew, gesturing toward the car park. Sure enough, two minibuses appeared, parking near the beach access. The new arrivals were directed toward the vehicles. As they walked, Frances continued recording, making sure to capture clear images of the men coordinating the operation. Then something unexpected happened. One of the passengers, a young woman, suddenly broke away from the group. She started running, heading away from the minibuses toward the town. One of the coordinators shouted and gave chase. Frances watched, horrified, as he caught up to the woman and grabbed her arm. She struggled, and even from Frances's position, her fear was visible. Frances didn't think. She simply acted. She stood up from her hiding place and called out in her most authoritative voice, the voice she had used 25 years ago as a police officer. "Let her go! Police!" Everyone froze. The coordinator released the woman's arm out of surprise. For a moment, there was complete silence on the beach. Then chaos erupted. The coordinators started shouting. The boat crew pushed their vessel back into the water and began rowing frantically. The new arrivals looked around in confusion and fear. Some began running in different directions. Frances realized immediately that she had made a tactical error. She wasn't police, she had no authority, and she was now exposed and potentially in danger. But she couldn't take it back. She had acted on instinct, unable to watch someone being forcibly restrained. The third man, the one who appeared to be in charge, looked in Frances's direction and said something to the other two coordinators. They started moving toward her. Frances made a quick decision. She ran, not toward the town, but along the coastal path, away from the men, but also away from the new arrivals. She didn't want to lead these men toward innocent people. She heard footsteps behind her, getting closer. Frances was 67 years old, and while she kept herself in reasonable shape, she couldn't outrun younger men. She would have to outsmart them instead. She left the path, scrambling down the rocks toward the water's edge. The terrain here was dangerous, with slippery rocks and tidal pools, but it was also difficult to navigate in the darkness. If she could just get far enough ahead, she could hide, wait for them to pass, then double back. She moved as quickly as she dared, her breath coming in gasps, her phone clutched in her hand. She had stopped recording when she started running, but the video was saved. If nothing else, if something happened to her, Jenny would alert the police and they would find the evidence. Behind her, she could hear the men cursing as they tried to follow her over the rocks. One of them had a flashlight, the beam sweeping back and forth as he searched for her. Frances found a narrow gap between two large boulders and squeezed into it, pressing herself against the cold stone. She tried to control her breathing, to stay silent. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure they would hear it. The men came closer. She could hear their voices, speaking in accented English. Where did she go? Can't see her? Check down there. Forget it. She's just an old woman who got scared. She's gone. We need to get out of here before the real police show up. The boss won't be happy. The boss will be less happy if we get arrested. Come on. Frances waited, frozen in her hiding spot, as the men retreated. She waited 5 more minutes, then 10, making sure they were really gone. Finally, she carefully emerged from between the boulders. Her hands were shaking. Her clothes were soaked from the spray and from lying against wet rock. But she was safe. And more importantly, she had the video evidence she needed. She carefully made her way back to the coastal path and then to her car. Once there, she sat for several minutes, letting the adrenaline fade, catching her breath. Then she texted Jenny. Safe. Coming home now. Jenny's response was immediate. Oh my God, what happened? Are you okay? I'll explain tomorrow. I'm fine. Frances drove home slowly, her mind racing. She had taken a huge risk tonight, had potentially put herself in serious danger. But she had also documented an active smuggling operation in progress. The video on her phone showed everything clearly. The boat arrival, the passengers, the coordinators, the minibuses, even the attempted escape and the violence used to prevent it. This was evidence that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. This would force action. When Frances arrived home, she immediately transferred the video file from her phone to her computer, then backed it up on a memory stick. She couldn't risk losing this evidence. Then she sat down and wrote an email. This time, she didn't send it to the regional police or the National Crime Agency. This time, she sent it directly to a journalist she had worked with years ago in London, someone she trusted to handle sensitive information responsibly. The email was brief. I have video evidence of a human smuggling operation that the police are aware of, but have failed to act upon. People are being threatened for witnessing these crimes. I'm sending you this footage because I believe the public has a right to know what's happening in their communities. Please handle this information carefully, but please also share it. These operations need to be stopped. She attached the video file and hit send. Then Frances poured herself a rare glass of whiskey and sat in her living room, waiting for dawn. The next morning, Frances woke to find her phone ringing. It was Sergeant Hughes, and he sounded agitated. Frances, what the hell happened last night? I just got a call from regional headquarters. They're saying there was some kind of incident at the beach, that the smuggling operation was disrupted, that the suspects fled. Were you there? Yes, Frances said simply. For God's sake, Frances. I thought we agreed you would just observe, not intervene. I didn't plan to intervene. But when I saw a woman being grabbed, being forced back to the minibuses against her will, I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. Hughes was silent for a moment. Are you hurt? I'm fine. Shaken, but fine. They're going to want to interview you. The regional team. They're coming down today, and Frances, they're not happy. I don't particularly care if they're happy, Sergeant. I care about stopping a criminal operation that's been running for months while they conducted their investigation. I have video evidence of last night's operation. Everything is documented clearly. If they want to interview me, I'm happy to cooperate, but I'm not going to apologize for doing what needed to be done. After Frances hung up, she checked her email. The journalist had already replied. Frances Cole? Is this really you? I've received your video and I'm reviewing it now. This is significant. Can we talk? Frances called the journalist, explained the situation in detail, and verified that the information could be published. The journalist promised to be careful with how the story was presented, to protect Frances's identity if requested, and to work with legal counsel to ensure everything was handled properly. 2 hours later, Sergeant Hughes arrived at Frances's cottage with 2 detectives from the Regional, Serious, and Organized Crime Unit. They introduced themselves as Detective Inspector Morrison and Detective Sergeant Walsh. Both looked professional but stern. Ms. Cole, Morrison said as they sat in Frances's living room, we need to talk about your actions last night. I'm happy to discuss them, Frances said calmly. Would you like tea? Morrison declined. Ms. Cole, you were explicitly asked, multiple times, to cease your own investigation and leave this matter to the professionals. Instead, you not only continued your surveillance, but actively intervened in an operation. Do you understand how dangerous that was? Do you understand how you might have compromised months of careful investigation? With respect, Detective Inspector, I understand perfectly. I spent 25 years in law enforcement. I know how investigations work. What I don't understand is why, after months of careful investigation, this smuggling operation was still running without interruption. How many people have been brought through Windermere Cross during that time? Dozens? Hundreds? And while you were building your case, a witness in my community was threatened by the smugglers. An innocent man who simply reported what he saw was intimidated at his own home. That incident is being addressed. Is it? Because from what I observed, the smugglers felt comfortable enough to threaten a witness in broad daylight. That suggests they don't fear the consequences of their actions. It suggests your investigation hasn't made them feel threatened at all. Walsh spoke up, his tone more conciliatory. Ms. Cole, we understand your frustration. But you have to understand, operations like this are complex. We can't just arrest the people we see on the beach. We need to build a case against the entire network. The organizers, the financiers, the people providing safe houses. If we move too soon, if we arrest the small players, the big ones disappear and set up somewhere else. I understand that logic, Francis said. But I would argue that protecting the community takes precedence over building a perfect case. And in any event, I have evidence that shows the operation in action. Video evidence that clearly documents what's happening. That should be helpful to your investigation, regardless of the timing. Morrison looked uncomfortable. About that. We'll need you to turn over that evidence. Of course. I have it here. Francis handed over the memory stick. But I should tell you that I've also provided a copy to a journalist. The story will be published, probably within the next day or two. The reaction was immediate. Morrison stood up, his face flushing with anger. You did what? Ms. Cole, that was highly irresponsible. Media coverage could completely derail our investigation. Quote, or it could force you to take action, Francis interrupted. Detective Inspector, I gave you and your colleagues weeks to respond to detailed evidence I provided. I reported a serious crime with dates, times, locations, and documentation. Your response was to tell me to stay out of it. When a witness was threatened, I was told you were working on it. How much longer should I have waited? How many more people should have been smuggled through here while you built your perfect case? That's not fair. Isn't it? Francis met his gaze steadily. I understand that you're doing your job. I respect that. But your job is also to protect the community. And I don't believe that's been happening here. The people being smuggled are vulnerable, potentially victims. The longer this operation runs, the more people are put at risk. And now, with media attention, you'll have no choice but to act quickly. That might not be convenient for you, but it's necessary. There was a long, tense silence. Finally, Walsh spoke, his tone measured. Ms. Cole, can you walk us through exactly what you observed last night? Everything you saw, everyone involved? Francis did so, providing a detailed account. She described the boat arrival, the number of passengers, the coordinators, the minibuses, the woman who tried to escape, and her own intervention. She answered their questions thoroughly and professionally. When she finished, Morrison had calmed down somewhat. This information is useful, he admitted grudgingly. And the video, we'll need to analyze it, but it does show clear evidence of the operation. Combined with what we already have, it strengthens our case significantly. So what happens now? Francis asked. Now we move, Walsh said. The media attention you've generated means we can't wait any longer. We'll conduct raids on the Henderson farm and several other locations we've been monitoring. We'll arrest everyone we can find who's involved in the operation. It won't be the perfect, comprehensive takedown we'd planned, but it will shut down this particular network." "What about the people being smuggled?" Francis asked. "The ones who arrived last night? The ones at the Henderson farm? They're victims in this as well. They'll be taken into custody initially for their own safety and for processing. Then they'll be assessed individually. Some might be eligible for asylum, others might be returned to their countries of origin, depending on their circumstances. But they'll be safe, and they'll be out of the smugglers' hands." Morrison added, "Ms. Cole, I want to be clear. What you did was dangerous and technically interfered with an ongoing investigation. If you weren't a former officer, if you didn't have the training and experience you have, the consequences could have been much more serious, both for you and for our case." "I understand," Francis said, "and I'm sorry if I complicated things. But I'm not sorry for taking action when I saw people in danger." The detectives left, taking the memory stick with them. Sergeant Hughes stayed behind for a moment. "You know they're going to be keeping an eye on you now," he said. "Regional headquarters, I mean. They don't like civilians getting involved in serious crimes, even former officers." "I can live with that," Francis said. "David," she used his first name, something she rarely did, "thank you for being understanding about all this. I know I put you in a difficult position." "You did," he agreed, "but I also can't say you were wrong. This needed to be addressed, and it wasn't being addressed quickly enough." He paused. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're here in Windermere Cross. We're lucky to have you." After he left, Frances sat alone in her cottage, feeling drained. The adrenaline from the previous night had long since faded, leaving her exhausted. She had done what needed to be done, but at what cost? Her privacy was gone. The media story would likely mention her name, her background. People in Windermere Cross would learn the truth about who she was. But as she sat there, Frances realized something. She didn't regret it. She had spent 20 years hiding from her past, trying to forget who she had been. But that person, Detective Chief Inspector Francis Cole, had been someone worth being, someone capable, skilled, dedicated. She had lost sight of that in the trauma of Margaret Thornton's death and her subsequent burnout. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding, to acknowledge that her past was part of her, neither something to be ashamed of, nor something to run from. The arrests happened the next day. Frances watched from the store as police vehicles, dozens of them, drove through Windermere Cross heading north toward the Henderson farm. By evening, the news was all over town. A major operation had taken place. Arrests had been made. A human smuggling network had been dismantled. The national news picked up the story that night. The journalist Frances had contacted had done good work, presenting the story responsibly while still making clear the seriousness of the situation and the failure of authorities to act more quickly. Frances's name was mentioned as a witness who documented the operation, but her police background was kept vague at her request. Still, in a town the size of Windermere Cross, word spread quickly. By the next morning, everyone knew that Frances Cole, the quiet cashier at Morrison's General Store, was a former detective who had single-handedly investigated and exposed a criminal operation. The reactions were mixed. Some people were amazed, impressed by her courage and skill. Others were hurt that she had never told them about her past, feeling that she had deceived them somehow. A few were angry, worried that her actions might have endangered the community. But most people were simply curious, seeing Frances with new eyes, wondering about the woman they thought they had known. The days following the arrests were strange for Frances. People in Windermere Cross looked at her differently now. Some avoided her, unsure how to interact with this new version of Frances. Others sought her out, asking questions about her past, about the investigation, about what it had been like to be a detective in London. Michael Morrison was supportive, telling Frances that he had always known there was something special about her, that he was proud to have her working at his store. Jenny Marsh was thrilled, telling anyone who would listen that she had helped with the investigation, that she had been Frances's backup. Carlos Martinez and his family were grateful, stopping by the store to thank Frances personally. "Because of you, those men will face justice," Carlos said. "Because of you, my family is safe." Sarah Henderson, the young mother with twin daughters, came in one day and hugged Frances tightly. "I always knew you were special," she said. "Thank you for protecting our community." Not all the reactions were positive. Some people felt Frances should have come forward earlier, that she should have told people about her background. "We could have helped," Arthur Henley said one morning, a touch of hurt in his voice. "You didn't have to do this alone." Frances tried to explain. "I came to Windermere Cross to leave that life behind. I never wanted to deceive anyone, but I also needed a fresh start. I hope you can understand that." "I suppose I do," Arthur said grudgingly. "But Frances, we're a community. We look out for each other. You should have trusted us." The local newspaper ran a feature story. "Hidden Hero. Former detective exposes smuggling ring." It was a flattering piece, portraying Frances as a brave, skilled investigator who had stepped up when needed. But Frances found it embarrassing, uncomfortable with the praise and attention. 3 weeks after the arrests, Frances received a phone call from Detective Inspector Morrison. His tone was much more friendly than it had been during their first meeting. "Ms. Cole, I wanted to update you on the case. We've now charged 17 people in connection with the smuggling operation. The Henderson farm was being used as you suspected, as a temporary holding location. We've also identified the main organizers. They were operating out of London, coordinating multiple smuggling routes along the coast." "What about the people who were being smuggled?" Frances asked. "They're being processed individually. Some are legitimate asylum seekers who will be allowed to stay. Others are economic migrants who will likely be returned to their home countries, though we're working with international organizations to ensure they have support. The important thing is, they're no longer in the hands of criminals. That's good to hear. Ms. Cole, I also wanted to say, your investigation was impressive. The level of detail, the thoroughness of your documentation, the way you identified patterns and connections, it was professional-grade police work. I was frustrated with you initially, but I can acknowledge now that your actions led to a successful operation that might have taken us considerably longer to achieve on our own." Frances was surprised by the compliment. "Thank you, Detective Inspector. That means a great deal coming from you. Have you ever considered returning to law enforcement? Not necessarily as an officer, but perhaps as a consultant? Someone with your skills and experience could be valuable." Frances thought about this for a moment. "That's kind of you to suggest, but no. I made my peace with leaving that life behind. What happened here was an exception. A necessary exception, but not something I want to make a habit of. I understand. But if you ever change your mind, let me know." After the call ended, Frances sat thinking about Morrison's offer. There had been a part of her, during the investigation, that had come alive again. The analytical mind, the attention to detail, the satisfaction of solving a puzzle and bringing criminals to justice. She had forgotten how good she was at this work, how fulfilling it could be. But she had also remembered the cost, the stress, the danger, the way the work could consume you if you let it. She had paid that price once before, and it had nearly destroyed her. No, Windermere Cross was her home now. Being Frances the cashier, even if everyone now knew she had also been Detective Chief Inspector Cole, was enough. One evening, about a month after the arrests, Frances was on her usual walk along the coastal path when she encountered Sergeant David Hughes. He was out of uniform, also walking, and they fell into step together. "How are you doing, Frances?" he asked. "With everything that's happened, I mean?" "I'm adjusting," Frances said. "It's strange, having everyone know about my past. I'd gotten used to my privacy, but it's not as bad as I feared. People have been kind for the most part." "They respect you," Hughes said. "What you did took courage. And it made Windermere Cross safer. People appreciate that, even if they don't always know how to express it." They walked in silence for a while, enjoying the evening air and the sound of the waves. "Can I ask you something?" Hughes said eventually. "That case you mentioned, the one that made you leave the police force, the hit and run. Do you ever think about it?" "Every day," Frances admitted. "Or at least I did for a long time. Less often now, but it never completely goes away. Margaret Thornton was her name. She was 73 years old, a mother, a grandmother, and I failed to bring her killer to justice." "You did everything you could." "I know. Intellectually, I know that. But knowing it and feeling it are different things." "Does this—" Hughes gestured vaguely, meaning the smuggling investigation. "Does it help? Does bringing these smugglers to justice make up for that old case in any way?" Frances considered the question carefully. "No, it doesn't make up for it. Nothing can. But—" She paused, finding the words, "It reminds me that I can still do good, that I still have skills and abilities that can help people. For 20 years, I've been punishing myself for one failure. Maybe it's time to remember the hundreds of times I succeeded, the thousands of people I helped over my career." "I think that sounds healthy." "I think so too." As they reached the end of the coastal path and prepared to part ways, Hughes turned to Frances. "You know, if you ever want to get more involved with community safety, in an official capacity, I'd be happy to have you. We have a neighborhood watch program, and we're always looking for volunteers. With your experience—" Frances smiled. "Let me think about it. Right now, I'm enjoying just being a regular member of the community, but maybe in time, I could contribute something." As Frances walked back to her cottage, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. Not the quiet, hidden peace of someone avoiding their past, but the genuine peace of someone who had faced their fears and come through stronger. She thought about the journey she had taken, from the young, idealistic police officer who joined the force at 23, through the successful career that had consumed her life, to the traumatic failure that had broken her, and finally to the quiet life in Windermere Cross, where she had slowly healed. And then, unexpectedly, to the investigation that had brought her back to herself. She wasn't Detective Chief Inspector Frances Cole anymore. She was just Frances, who happened to have once been a detective. The two identities had merged, become one, and that was okay. 1 year later, it was a warm afternoon in late spring, almost exactly 1 year after the night Frances had documented the smuggling operation. She was working her usual shift at Morrison's General Store, helping customers, restocking shelves, going through the familiar routines that had shaped her life for 20 years. The bell above the door jingled, and Frances looked up to see a young woman entering. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and cautious eyes. She looked around the store uncertainly, then approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said in accented English. "I am looking for Frances Cole. Is she here?" "I'm Frances Cole," Frances said, studying the young woman. There was something familiar about her, though Frances couldn't immediately place where she had seen her before. The young woman's face broke into a smile. "You do not remember me. That is okay. But I remember you. You were on the beach that night, when I tried to run. You called out, you distracted the men, and in the confusion, I got away. I hid until morning. Then I found police station. I gave them information about smugglers, about how I came here. They helped me." Frances felt a surge of emotion. This was the woman she had seen being grabbed, the one whose attempted escape had prompted Frances's impulsive intervention. "You're safe now?" "Yes, I am refugee from Syria. They processed my claim, and I have been granted asylum. I can stay in Britain legally now. I work at restaurant in next town, and I am taking English classes. I am, how do you say, rebuilding my life." "I'm so happy to hear that," Frances said sincerely. "What's your name?" "Amira. And I wanted to find you, to thank you. Because of what you did that night, I escaped. The other people from the boat, they were taken to that farm, and some had trouble with authorities, had to go back to their countries. But I escaped, and I could tell true story of what happened, and they believed me. You saved my life, Miss Frances." "I don't know about that." "No, you did. And I want you to know. I am using this chance you gave me. I am working hard. I am following laws. I am trying to be good citizen. I want to make you proud." Frances came around the counter and impulsively hugged the young woman. "You already have," she said quietly. "The fact that you're here, that you're rebuilding your life, that you're safe. That's all I could hope for." After Amira left, promising to visit again soon to let Frances know how she was doing, Frances stood at the store window, watching her walk down the high street. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The nighttime observations, the dangerous investigation, the split-second decision to call out on the beach. Any of those moments could have gone differently, but they had gone the way they did, and as a result, one person at least had found safety and a new beginning. It wasn't justice for Margaret Thornton. That wound would never fully heal. But it was something. It was a reminder that individual actions mattered, that speaking up made a difference, that doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when it was risky, was worth it. The bell above the door jingled again, and Michael Morrison came in from his lunch break. "Did I just see you hugging a customer?" he asked with amusement. "A friend," Frances corrected. "That was a friend?" Michael smiled. "You know, Frances, I've been thinking. You've been working here for 20 years now. That's longer than any employee I've ever had. And especially after everything that happened last year, after you basically saved this town from becoming a smuggling hub, I feel like you deserve something more than just being a cashier." "I'm perfectly happy being a cashier," Frances said, though she was curious where this was going. "What if I made you a partner? Or at least manager? You basically run this place anyway. You should have the title and the pay that goes with it." Frances was genuinely surprised. "Michael, that's very generous, but think about it at least. You've earned it, Frances. And selfishly, I'd like to know that when I eventually retire, the store will be in good hands. Your hands." Frances thought about it. For 20 years, she had been content to simply be an employee, to have minimal responsibility beyond her daily tasks. But perhaps that had been part of her penance, her way of punishing herself for past failures. Perhaps it was time to stop doing that, to accept recognition when it was offered, to acknowledge her own worth. "All right," she said, "let's talk about it seriously. I'm not making any promises, but I'm open to discussing it." Michael beamed. "Excellent! We'll sit down next week, go over the details." That evening, Frances took her usual walk along the coastal path. The beach below was peaceful, Just a few families enjoying the late afternoon sun. No boats were arriving in the darkness. No people were being smuggled through Windermere Cross anymore. The smuggling network had been permanently disrupted by the arrests. Some members of the organization had gone to prison. Others had fled the country. The Henderson farm had been sold to a young couple who were converting it into an organic farm and bed and breakfast. The marina had new management that was far more diligent about monitoring boats and following procedures. Windermere Cross had returned to being a quiet, peaceful town. But now it was a quiet, peaceful town that was a bit more vigilant, a bit more aware of what went on in its community. And Frances was no longer an anonymous cashier with a hidden past. She was a known quantity, a person with a history, someone the community could turn to if they needed help. It was different from what she had imagined her life would be, but it was good. It was right. As Frances walked, she thought about all the lives that had intersected in this small town. Carlos Martinez, who had been brave enough to speak up even when threatened. The people like Amira, who had been seeking better lives and got caught up in criminal operations. The smugglers who had exploited vulnerable people for profit and were now facing consequences. Sergeant Hughes, who had tried to balance protocol with doing what was right. And herself, former Detective Chief Inspector Frances Cole, who had thought her career in justice was over, but had found a way to make a difference one more time. She thought about Margaret Thornton, too, as she often did. "I hope you'd be proud of me," Frances said quietly to the memory. "I know I failed you. I know I couldn't bring your killer to justice, but I tried to do better this time. I tried to save people who needed saving, and I succeeded, at least a little bit." The wind carried her words away, out over the sea. Frances stood for a moment, looking out at the horizon, then turned and walked back toward town, toward her home, toward the life she had built here. She was 68 years old now. She had lived many lives. The young police officer, the decorated detective, the broken woman hiding from her past, the cashier building a quiet life, and finally, the investigator who came out of retirement one last time. All of these versions of herself were real. All were part of who she was. And for the first time in 20 years, Frances Cole felt whole. As she reached the edge of town, she saw a group of children playing in the small park near the library. One of them, she recognized Emma Henderson, Sarah's daughter, saw Frances and waved enthusiastically. "Hi, Miss Frances. Guess what? I got an A on my school project about community heroes, and I wrote about you." Frances smiled and waved back. "That's wonderful, Emma. I'm very proud of you." As she continued walking home, Frances reflected on what the child had said. A community hero. It was a title she never would have given herself, one she never sought. But perhaps that was what she had become, not through any grand gesture, but simply by doing what needed to be done, by using the skills she had to protect people who needed protection. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Frances reached her cottage, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. On her nightstand, the old photograph still sat, the young detective in uniform, confident and capable. But now, when Frances looked at that photograph, she didn't feel regret or pain. She felt recognition. That person was still here, just older, wiser, more aware of her limitations and her strengths. Frances made herself dinner, listened to the evening news on the radio, and prepared for another day. Tomorrow, she would go to work at the store. She would serve customers, stock shelves, chat with neighbors. The ordinary tasks of an ordinary life. But she was no longer just Frances the cashier. She was Frances Cole, former detective, current store employee, community member, and when necessary, protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. And that was enough. That was more than enough. As Frances drifted off to sleep that night, she felt a profound sense of contentment. She had found her way home, not to London where she had spent her career, but to Windermere Cross, where she had found herself again. The past could not be changed. Margaret Thornton's killer would likely never be found. That failure would always be part of Frances's story, but it was no longer the only part, no longer the defining moment. There were other moments now, other stories, other successes. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not perfection, not an unblemished record, but the willingness to keep trying, to keep caring, to keep doing what was right, even when it was difficult. Frances Cole had done that. She had faced her past, confronted her fears, and emerged stronger. She had helped people who needed help. She had made her community safer. She had been a hero, quietly and without fanfare, in exactly the way she needed to be. And tomorrow, she would wake up and be Frances again. Just Frances, who worked at the store and walked by the sea and knew who she was, finally and completely. It was a good life, a life worth living, a life that honored both who she had been and who she had become. And as sleep claimed her, Frances smiled, at peace with herself and her choices, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.